Hello, everybody, and welcome to Parasha Bo this week on the Waypoint podcast. So, let's just jump into it because we are right in the middle of an epic. We're about to go through the final few plagues that are left, locust, darkness, and then, of course, the death of the firstborn. And so, a few things happen here. We have the locusts, they go away. Pharaoh, again, not changing his mind. We have the darkness, and the Israelites had light in their homes. And actually, Brad has prepared a lovely lesson surrounding this particular darkness. So I'm not going to give anything away there. And then we have the death of the firstborn. The rest of the Torah portion is actually fairly lengthy description on the Passover Seder, as it will be continued from here forward in remembrance of the Exodus. So there's actually a lot of detail about how to observe the Passover Seder, some of the questions that we're familiar with. If you've been to a Seder, you're going to see some of that stuff here. And this is actually also, I just want to highlight verse 49 in chapter 11. The same Torah applies to the native as well as the outsider who dwells among you. This happens directly after the Israelites ask the Egyptians for their riches as they're on their way out. And so this happens, and we also understand that there are many Egyptians who decided to side with Israel and leave with them. And so now we have outsiders, and God seems to be very clear here. They have chosen to be with you, so now you will treat them as equals. And if they want to have, partake in the Passover Seder, they have to be circumcised too. But we will treat them as equals. And so that's actually incredibly progressive forethought for an ancient document of this type. Moving on, then we have the redemption of the firstborn laws found in chapter 13 as a result of the price that it took to pay for the Israelites to come out of Egypt, the firstborn. So all firstborn to Israel from here on out will be redeemed and belong essentially to God. And that's about, and that includes animals. And that's where actually we end the Torah portion right before we start. Just after the Pharaoh had let them go, and he has not yet decided to pursue them, but he's going to. But that's next week. But for now, I'm going to hand it over now to Brad, and he's prepared a nice little lesson for you. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for joining us this week on The Waypoint.
Hello, and allow me to personally welcome you to another edition of The Waypoint. This week's Parsha is got to be one of my absolute favorites, and it's because of the topic that I'm going to be discussing today. The final plague before the plague of the firstborn. And this year, I noticed a lot of things that I didn't notice before going on in this Parsha, particularly with this plague. So Exodus chapter 10, from verses 21 through 23. For those of you reading a Stone Edition Tanakh, I'll read it from that first, and then I'll read it from the JPS because there's something interesting about the difference between the two and where they meet in the middle in their meaning. So from the Stone Edition, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch forth your hand toward the heavens, and there will be darkness over the land of Egypt, and the darkness will become darker." So Moses stretched forth his hand toward the heavens, and there was thick darkness over the entire land for 3 days. They did not see each other. No one rose from his place for 3 days, but for all the children of Israel, there was light in their dwellings. Now, I suppose I'll go ahead and just read from the JPS 2006 here. That is what you'll find on Safaria for those of you at home. Then Hashem said to Moshe, "Hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and a thick darkness descended upon the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another for 3 days. No one could move about, but all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. Now, so the reason I read both there is because if you notice in the Stone Edition, it says that the darkness became darker. And then in the JPS 2006, it describes it as a darkness that could be touched. This was a tangible, palpable darkness, whereas the darkness became darker actually has its own implications. And the Midrash Tanhuma is fascinating on the subject because what it relates is the idea of a rebellious servant who has to be disciplined, and that the darkness in this aspect is the one who is carrying out the discipline. Egypt would, in this case, be the rebellious servant. And what the Midrash points out is, say that the one in charge of carrying out the discipline was tasked by the master to give this rebellious servant 50 lashes. And the discipliner, I suppose you could say, chose of their own volition to give an additional 50. And so the total number of lashes became 100. So that's the idea here, is that Hashem was telling Moses, and Moses called down darkness, but the darkness became darker. The Midrash relays this in terms of almost the darkness having a sense of consciousness of its own, in that it became darker on its own. So dark, in fact, that, again, as we read in the JPS, it was a tangible darkness. This is a darkness that could be touched. It was a darkness that could be felt. It was a physical darkness. The reality is, we couldn't really conceive of what this is like. This, I would say, is a true darkness. I would say this is true night. In Genesis, we read the separation of darkness from light. And darkness was called night, the light was called day, and then we read evening and morning were the first day. I would say we've never truly experienced night, at least not the night that's explained in Genesis. And I'll explain why in a moment. We live in a world where darkness and light are still intermingled and intertwined with one another. That's why what we do when we're obeying the commandments is we are separating light from darkness. That's what obeying the commandments does, is it separates light from darkness. And that's only possible if there is some level of intermingling between light and darkness. This darkness that was experienced in Egypt was so much so that candlelight wouldn't even be visible. The darkness itself overcame a flame. It overcame actual light. Like, light just couldn't exist within this darkness. This darkness was utterly absent of light. The darkness that we experience on a regular basis every evening still has an element of light intermingled, which is why we can see things. But this was not that kind of darkness. This was a darkness that was so thick that if you were to light a match in front of you, you wouldn't see the flame. It would be overtaken by this darkness. So that would be true night. And the reason I say that is I'm reminded of Yeshua's words in John chapter 9, verse 4, where Yeshua says, "We must do the work of the one who sent me while it is day, because night is coming when no man can work." And let's think about that for a moment. Why can no man work when it is night? If it's the night that I'm talking about, if it's the night that Egypt experienced in this plague, it's because there is no light to separate it from it. That's what our obedience is, again, is to separate light from darkness. That is the work that we do. That is the obedience. And so if there is no light to separate from the darkness, then no one can work at night. There's no work to be done. There's no light to separate from the darkness. So Egypt at this point is experiencing a true night, right? No man can work, and they couldn't see each other. And I think that that's directly tied also to the fact that no man can work in such a darkness. No man can work in such a darkness, and as a result, the image of God cannot be seen. It is so dark that the image of God is not visible in this darkness, right? So they couldn't see each other. And mankind is made in the image of Hashem. But they couldn't see that. They couldn't see each other. They couldn't see the image of God because there is no light to be separated from this darkness. There was no work to be done. Conversely, while this is happening for the Egyptians, though, the Israelites have light in their home, and this is because of their obedience. Their obedience is the light at this point. And because it was so dark for the Egyptians that they couldn't leave their homes, there was really no work for the Israelites at this point to do. You could actually say that they experienced rest. I don't know that I would say whether or not it was Shabbat at this point, but they did experience a type of Shabbat. They experienced a type of rest from their labor, from their work. And this is a rest that they experienced prior to the final judgment, and that has its own list of implications that I could probably go on about. The fact that this is the night that came before the final judgment. This is the rest they experienced before the 10th plague, when the hammer came down on Egypt. But I think the takeaway from this is that at this point, Israel, I think, is really learning where they stand in the world. They're learning their position, right? They have light in their home. That's what we read in verse 23. And this is because of their obedience. This is because they are Hashem's chosen people. And inasmuch as they had light in their home, they were light in their home because of this. The same way that they are the light to the nations, right? It is they who Hashem has chosen to demonstrate the correct way to the rest of the world. And as Yeshua said, night is coming where no man can work. We're headed towards that, and we need to find ourselves not only in the presence of light when that happens, but if we can, find a way to demonstrate our own light. And that's what we do, again, on a daily basis with our obedience. It's all a learning process. Is why we say practicing Torah, not observing Torah, is because, this is a point where we're still learning, and it's a daily struggle, but it is something that will ultimately pay off when night comes and there is light to be seen. We don't want to end up like Egypt. So with that said, take that, ponder it, take it into the next week. Let me know your thoughts on this week's Parsha, and tell me what you derive from it. With that, I will hand it off to my colleague Seamus for his final thoughts. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome back. So, my final thoughts. Thank you, first of all, to Brad for the wonderful lesson. So I could not help but think the entire time about the words of the Master when he said, let me go ahead and pull it up here, in fact. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. And so that's from John chapter 9, verse 4, by the way. The point, however, here is that once it is night, you can no longer do the labors. And so, to kind of tie in Brad's message here just a little bit as a final thought, we work now so that when the darkness falls, we will have the light. And those works are not like, we're not saying faith by works or salvation by works. It's not what I'm saying. Works in the context of this particular parable, but faithfulness, faith, not just belief, but also, living your life in a way that demonstrates your faith. These are mitzvahs. These are the good works that are associated with faith. The righteous shall live by faith. And faithfulness is demonstrated by your works. As James rightfully put it, faith without works is dead. And so when the night falls, it will be the garments of the mitzvahs that we wear that will shine and give us the light that we need when there is no more time for labor. And that was, in the words of the master, kind of warning us to prepare that ahead of time, just as the Israelites were doing as well. When the darkness fell on them, they were prepared because of their faithfulness. There's also a lot of things happening that you could argue fantastical things are going on around them, but it still does not deplete the message. The message should be fairly clear to our everyday lives, even though this fantastical thing is happening. There is something to be learned from that. And I think that's this week's lesson. So as we go into this week, for the rest of this week on Parashas Bo, which means come to Pharaoh, Bo, come. That's another thing. God is everywhere, even with Pharaoh. So he says, come to Pharaoh. And so no matter how dark it gets, it may seem like we're living in the absence of God. We may not be able to see our light right now until darkness falls. But even when darkness falls, God is still there, and he is with us everywhere. He's even in and with Pharaoh. So when we stand before really hard times, trials, and moments of darkness in our own lives, we have to remember that God said, come, as in, I'm already here. I'm waiting for you. And with that, have a wonderful, blessed rest of your week. Thank you once again to my compatriot Brad for the amazing lesson. And we will see you guys next week. Shalom. Special thanks to this month's Patreon supporters: